factors, climate and environmental action. So environmental and effectiveness, that is one criteria. The second is cost effectiveness. The third is meets criteria is whether that policy action meets the distributional consideration. And the fourth criteria is whether the policy action through this instrument meets the institutional feasibility. For example, if the government is implementing a tax instrument as a tax law, taxes and charges. So in terms of environmental effectiveness, what the government has to look at is depends on ability to set a tax at a level that induces behavioral change. Whereas, for example, taxing tobacco products, cigarettes and other products to kind of aim at reducing tobacco consumption, cigarette smoking, etc. So the government has to look at in terms of effectiveness, it needs to look at the ability to set a tax at a level that induces behavioral change. At what level of action it is expected to have a behavioral change. Next is cost effectiveness. So it is better with broad application, higher administrative cost, where institutions are weak to implement the tax laws. So that also has to be considered in cost effectiveness. The third is meet distributional consideration, whether it may lead to it's a regressive action or a progressive action, whether it can improve the revenue recycling or whether it can contribute to behavioral change. The next is institutional feasibility. Often politically unpopular, it could be, maybe difficult to enforce with underdeveloped institutions. This is an example on tax and charges as an instrument of policy. Now, if you look at, for example, subsidies and other incentives as an instrument of policy action, that depends on program design and less certain than regulation and standards. That do not involve regulation and standards, but it depends upon program design and effectiveness of the program, how it's reached, etc. Or requires a lot of research in that direction, policy analysis in that direction. In terms of cost effectiveness, depends on level and program design, whether it can be market distorting. If a subsidy can distort the prices, can contribute to inflation, or it can contribute to other economic consequences. The third is distributional consideration in subsidies, whether the benefit selected participant, whether it reaches the participant, possibly some that do not need it. There is always kind of leakage or there is a kind of slippage if and government is implementing subsidies or other incentives for targeted population. So the government has to look at the possibilities of leakage, the efficiency of controlling the leakage, fixing the leakage, and the last is institutional feasibility. Popular with recipients, potential resistance from vested interests. This could be popular with the recipients, but it could be see potential resistance from vested interests. Can be difficult to phase out. So this is one example. And the next is, I'm not going through all the aspects of instruments, but only some selected aspects of instrument. The next is research and development. So in terms of environmental effectiveness, depends on consistent funding. When technologies are developed and policies for diffusion may have higher benefits in long-term research and development as an instrument of policy action. In implementing a technology, new technology, or scientific action, etc. The second is cost effectiveness. That depends on program design and the degree of risk in terms of that research and development instrument as a policy measure. The third is distributional consideration. Initially, it may benefit selected participants. There is potentially easy to fund to be misallocated in research and development unless you have very robust criteria for distributing research and development grants. as an instrument of policy action that will target populations, different groups of population. The last is institutional feasibility for research and development as a policy instrument. Requires many separate decisions, depends on research capacity and long-term funding. The rest, there are similarly for each of the instrument of policy, one has to look at, policy analysts will look at, policymakers have to look at these criteria in deciding a policy action. So there is always necessity to do evaluations on the assumptions of the instruments, whether they are representative of the best practice rather than theoretical perfect. This assessment is based primarily on experience and literature from other, if that is from other countries, maybe just peer-reviewed articles, but they need to be more rigorously analyzed.
What is the source, Dr. Aruk? Excuse me, what is the source of this table, please?
I think it is in the bottom. It's hiding. When I distribute the slides, I'll be able to give. It is at the bottom, which is hiding.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, what is policy analysis process? A means of synthesizing information, including research results, to produce a format for policy decision, the laying out of alternative choices, and the determining the future needs of policy relevant information. That is the main definition of policy process. Means of synthesizing evidence, information, including results, to produce a format for policy action, and determining the future needs for policy relevant information. The choice of best policy among set of alternatives with the aid of reason and evidence. That is the most critical in policy analysis. And the third is determining which various alternative public or government policies will most achieve a given set of policy goals in the light of the relations between the policies and the goals. That is the third important aspect of policy analysis process. In policy making process, public policy making is a complex process. It's not very straightforward, simple process. A lot of actions go into public policy making. A policy analysis is one of the process of policy making that involves many participants, many stakeholders with different roles, interests, and resources. The study of public policy is the study of who gets what, why, and what difference it makes. So therefore, policy analysis today, of course, there is a class of researchers in government as well as in academic institutions as well as in organizations which deal with the consultancy. There's a class of researchers, a group of researchers who focus on who expertise on public policy analysis. So that means the study of who gets what, population, who gets what, why, and what difference it makes to different target population. For public policy is an instrument of government officials or agencies, if it's a government policy. But if it is an organizational policy, it is also an instrument of organization. It is goal-oriented and purpose action, not a random chance behavior. So policy actions are not just random. If it happens random, if any policy action is a random exercise, a random action, it has no tangible outcome. It may not be a best way of implementing a policy action. And today's world of policy making, there's hardly any such scope for any random action or chance action, chance behavior. Policies are, of course, action taken over time by government officials, not separate.
Dr. Belia, can you please turn your camera off? Dr. Belia, can you turn your camera off, please?
Yeah, yes. No. Yes. Is it off now? Hello?
I'm talking about Dr. Belia. Dr. Belia, can you turn your camera off? I'm not talking about Dr. Aruk Smile.
No, put your camera on, doctor.
Yes, so,
No, here. Click here, doctor.
oh, it's off.
Yes, it is on. Just click.
Can you back again, Dr. Arcos
Yeah,
Mai?
yeah,
Can
yeah,
you come
just
back
so-
again? Yeah, can you show your camera? Turn your camera on.
yeah, just one second. It's on.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah,
Keep
okay.
going.
Okay. Just a second. So who are the stakeholders? Who are the actors in policy analysis and policy making? Policy analysis delivers knowledge, evidence, information, and recommendation, which has its producers, beneficiaries, and contributors. So it's not a single group of people. It's always there is a range of group of people who are involved in policy making, different stakeholders in policy analysis and policy making. So that is very crucial in making policy more perfect. Stakeholders can broadly be divided into policymakers, policy beneficiaries, researchers, and analysts who are knowledge producers. And stakeholders such as education practitioners, researchers, local administrators, for example, in European Commission, who can be beneficiaries, but also contributors of information and insights for analysis. So therefore, in the realm of policy making and implementation, these roles can and often do overlap. Sometimes researchers do policy analysis, but also they are also involved in policy making with policymakers. Policymakers might be deeply involved and might steer and manage the production of analytical knowledge. So sometimes policymakers are directly involved in policy analysis, but sometimes they outsource policy analysis to researchers and policy analysts. So it's a network. It's a combination of different stakeholders which produce actionable evidence for policy making, and also which leads to policy decisions. Analysts might influence policy decision in ways that make them the de facto decision makers. So policy analysis today, policy analysis are important professionals who contribute a lot and might influence policy decisions in governments in ways that make them de facto decision makers. Stakeholders might be a source of vital information for the analysis, or they might have commissioned it themselves and also directly participate in the formulation and validation of its findings. So all stakeholders have to play their role through the cycle, through the policy cycle, in agenda setting, in policy analysis and evidence synthesis, and then finally in policy recommendation and making a decision on policy analysis, but also at the later stages of policy monitoring and evaluation. So there's something called modes of policy augmentation or policy process or policy analysis, the modes of augmentation. These refer to consultations, meetings, or discussions, or panel debates, etc.